Well, I'm in Donegal, and the tractors outside are moving along the road with big wagons of turf coming home from the bog. And there's a man on the roof, and he's painting the tiles. Now you might be saying to yourself, what in the name of God would you be painting the tiles on the roof for? Or maybe you paint them every year, I don't know. But it's something that I only heard of this year. I was looking at my neighbour's tiles. I was looking at his roof and I says to myself, God, that's a very fresh looking roof. And I said it to him, I said, did you get a new roof? He said, no, I got the tiles painted. Well, I said, I never heard of that. Well, he said, I do it every year, and it keeps them fresh and it keeps them healthy and it keeps them, they're better able to protect you from the rain. Okay, says I. And he says, they look better. And to be fair, it looked like a new roof. So I says to myself, I'll have a bit of that. The man came this morning and he's up on the roof. And he'd be scraping the moss and the lichen or whatever else is up there. He'd be scraping the tiles clean before he'd paint them. Now that's a tricky job. And I can hear him scratching. It's like if I had an enormous mouse in the attic. Now I don't have an enormous mouse in the attic. And so I'm telling you that because when I'm reading from the book, there's a possibility that once or twice in the background you might hear something scraping. And you'd be saying to yourself, poor old Michael, he has mice in the attic. Or mice in the head. But I don't. 'Tis your man on the roof. I'm going to read today, do you know something? I would really like, if you don't mind, I'm going to read another little piece from that book on Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. Because it's a crucial book for me. When I'm reading these excerpts, I'm trying to do two things. I'm trying to, in some way, allow the podcast to be about something relaxing and pleasant during the summer, rather than to be doing too much reflection on personal faith. It's like a holiday time. It's you take a break from everything. And I find it sometimes helpful to take a break, even from faith. From the reflection, the meditation, and the prayerfulness. It's actually sometimes a help to take a break. And sometimes, to be honest with you, the break only lasts maybe a day or two, but when you stop, even in prayer for a moment, there's kind of wonderful things happen. Because it's not about praying. It's not about, in the sense, it's not about, me doing things, activating things in my life, regulating my life with sort of, monologues to God, which is sometimes what prayer becomes for me. I'm doing all the talking. And I always remember, years and years ago, somebody quoting that great line from the Old Testament, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And they were saying, like, most of the time we say, "Listen, Lord, your servant is speaking." So sometimes, if I have a routine, it's good to stop it. It's called a holiday. And if I have patterns of engagement with somebody, it's good to take a break. Even with the woman that I love so much, the beloved wife, with the family, it's good sometimes to have a day out, to have a little space to yourself, as they say. And it's not that you want to be away from your loved one, but you kind of relish them more when you come back to them. You miss them. And taking the break is also good. It's with prayer or with God, I think taking a break is like when you realize something deeper happens than just what you planned. So everything that you do in relation to religion is your choice, right? It's like you choose if you go to a service or to a Eucharist or you choose if you go into a church. You choose if you do a Buddhist meditation or a Buddhist, prayerful practice or if you, whatever you go to a holy well, say a rosary, whatever you do, it is you doing it. It is you choosing to do it. It is you responding to the possibility of God or transcendent being and saying, well, I will engage in this dialogue. And you can say to yourself, I know that everything happens because God wills it. So in some sense, when I use a rosary or a prayer rope or when I do a meditation or if I go to a church, that in some way I'm being called in this by God. I'm responding. And that's okay. That's true. There's no other way to look at God's presence in your life or God's presence in the world other than as an aspect of depth around what is happening in the ordinary. Thomas Aquinas used to call it concursus. He came up with this notion that the great wisdom of God revealing himself in creation is that it happens concurrently with the revelation of the material world. It's not a separate space. It's not a ghost in the machine, really. It is a depth. The flower has a dimension of depth that is beautiful. It's a really hidden idea about God in the Christian tradition, and it's very, very interesting that you'll even get it in the Desert Fathers where I think Evagrius, he talks about that if you had a manifestation of we'll say, Christ, if you visualized Christ in your prayer, he says it's most likely a demon. And that's a very strong thing to say, but what he's getting at is God is not working through ghosts. God is not working through, phantoms floating around within the universe. The universe is God. Not in a pantheistic way, but the universe is the manifestation of transcendent being. And God's love is everywhere. And God's voice is everywhere. And God's presence is everywhere. It's not just in the storm. It's in the silence after the storm. It's in the leaf falling. It's in everything that happens. And I found that very consoling when I was ill over the past 7 or 8 years, over the time that I've been doing these books. And these books are very much the fruit of traumas that happened to me because of illness. But when I began to see that the books were coming out from the trauma of illness, but in fact the trauma of illness itself was what God was saying to me, then I really started to get a positive grip on the idea of being ill or aging. I found that very consoling. That God wasn't like a ghost. He wasn't, giving me messages like an apparition, but that he was in everything. There is nothing but God. So when I'm walking out on the beach, or I'm walking under the lovely trees in Leitrim, I'm not trying to visualize some presence. I'm actually experiencing the trees as present. The waves of the ocean, the little wrinkles of wave on the ocean, on the beach. I'm experiencing it as presence. It is the presence of God. And when I experience my own mind, even in its anxiety, I'm experiencing God's presence. You know, I'm a very anxious person. I'm a very neurotic person. I always was since I was a child. But faith has allowed me to understand that neurosis, even that neurosis, as God's presence. Exactly in the same way as joyful, calm abiding, when I feel completely calm and I feel completely at home, and I'm so serene, like sitting in the garden or sitting on the patio, and it's all beautiful. I can experience that as in some way, it's not that God is giving me happiness, but my happiness is God. God is closer to me than I am to myself. God is giving me not the happiness, but is the happiness. This happiness I feel under the trees or sitting on the patio, this is the enfolding tender arms of God. And this moment has infinite depth to the ground of all being manifest in this moment. And that's concursus, if you like. It's that sense that the revelation of God is not separate from all the revelation of the cosmos as it unfolds. So when it comes to illness or depression or old age, I'm not old, I'm only 70. Yeah, you'll be getting there. When it comes to these things, the fragility of the body, how do I deal with that? How do I deal with the anxiety I feel, the neurosis I feel, the agitation of the mind, which is who I am most of the time. I have my Gandhi moments and I have my Dalai Lama moments. I have them under the tree or walking on the beach and calm serenity, yes, but most of the time, to be honest, I'm a neurotic, agitated human being, full of anxiety, full of worries, full of ego, full of all the kind of frailties of being human, full of negativity and anger sometimes about other people. I really am. Really, I'm a human being. And that has a kind of an aspect to it that doesn't feel sweet. Doesn't feel as sweet as, having a glass of wine on the patio on a sunny day. And when illness came to me initially in 2011 and another bout 2 years later and 3 years later, and I really found it hard to handle. I couldn't cope with it, to be honest with you. I could cope with being happy all my life, but the idea that some illness had struck me down and it landed me in 2011, 2012 in ferocious depression. couldn't make sense of it. Now, 10 or 11 years later, what has the journey been for me in a nutshell? And I'll tell you, the journey for me has been the realization that the experience of that neurosis, that's God's presence in this moment. The darkness, if you like, use the image of light for joy and the good times, then use, let's say, the darkness for times of suffering. I was discovering that darkness is in itself an intimacy with God. It's not to say that God is a sadist or, is trying to make me suffer. But the suffering of being me, whether that be a fragility mentally or physically, is also creation. It is also part of the cosmos. It is part of the world. And if I'm saying that God is everywhere, there is nothing but God. God concursively is revealing himself in every quantum, every atom of the world. Then this neurosis that I'm experiencing, this darkness that I'm experiencing is actually God experiencing it. And that's like mind-blowing, whatever wonderful word you'd say, extraordinary. But the little word I'd use, it's consoling. It's a fierce consolation if you're ill, if you're aging, if you have anxiety for any reason, to feel loved. And when you initially think of God's presence, you may think of it as something separate from you, from the universe, like the ghost floating around, like the great God above the clouds. But gradually, as your faith matures, you realize you put away childish ideas, you put away those notions of a God of interventions, and you realize that the intervention is the entire cosmos, and that you are part of that cosmos, and that there is nothing but God in the whole process. And that sense of being in the world is consoling if you are suffering. At least I found it consoling, I have to say. And then it began to allow me to focus on the idea of the crucifixion. I mean, the pinnacle of the whole story, revelation, insight, theology of Christianity is to do with the crucifixion. I think it's a mistake if you put the crucifixion out on its own as a kind of an image and idea, and you can get a bit morbid and negative. But if you enfold it within the whole context of the Trinity, of God's cosmic revelation, then this moment of suffering is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the idea of the great cosmic Christ, the omega point of all cosmic revelation is, in a sense, the full revelation of Christ. But that's like simply to say the full completion of God filling the universe. So as we journey towards that, we can hold on to that image of Christ on the cross. And in some way it mirrors our own suffering. It's like an archetype. It's like a template. It's like a construction within which we can live and breathe and understand our own being. There's two things that fascinate me. One is the way that St. Paul talks about it's not Christ who lives now. It's not I who lives now, but Christ who lives in me. And that's not to say that there's a ghost inside you called Christ. It is to say that your molecules, your little quantums and atoms are Christ. Your breath is the breath of Christ. Christ lives in you. And also the same is true in a cosmic way, that, and this is the second thing that fascinates me, it's the prayer of St. Patrick, where he says, I bind unto myself today, the strong presence of the Trinity. So that's where you start. You don't think about, let's say, crucifixion on its own. That's a morbid, that's a dark, obsessive kind of focus, a misplaced emphasis, and you'd find it in Europe after, generations of the Black Death, when things got very grim. You still find it, where people suffer, for example, in prison. It's amazing how they'll focus on crucifixion, because it is the aspect of God's presence that becomes most relevant. Not that they want to be morbid about it, but that they find hope in it. It's a template, an archetype, a kind of a construct that embodies us. Not Christ, not me who lives now, but Christ who lives in me. So I'm kind of carrying on this suffering of Christ, not for sadistic reasons or morbid reasons, but because this is the beautiful revelation of God. And I feel that it was a turning point for me when I began to experience suffering in that context. You go into the woods as a child and you think God is with you like he's a ghost behind the tree and he'll appear to you, or Christ will kind of walk out and wink at you, wave at you. But no. And maybe that's what's behind that strange and wonderful text. Do you know where Thomas doesn't believe, and then you have this moment where Christ appears and he says, look, there's the holes in my hands, there's the wound on my side, put your finger in. That's what you need, is it? Proof, like literal proof. And so Thomas says, my Lord and my God, and then somebody, I think it's the writer, says, well, no, they put this in the mouth of Christ. Christ says, well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So it's a real kind of emphasis on the idea that we do find God through these images, through the possibility of apparition, through the possibility of, a God who intervenes by kind of, he's there in the garden, I go out and I actually see him. But there's something deeper going on, and that is that the revelation of God is really, it really is the universe. And I think that's what St. Patrick meant in that profound prayer that begins with the Trinity. I bind unto myself today the Trinity. But he goes on then, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ above me. Now, he's not talking about a floating spirit. The way to do that as an exercise is wherever you are sitting, look now at what is before you. Could be a wall, could be another human being, could be your pet cat, could be a tree, a mountain, whatever. Could be a bus. Whatever is before you is Christ. And behind you, and above you, and below you. So it's the two ways to read that text of St. Patrick. One is, as we might do innocently as children, Christ is floating behind me, before me, above me, around me. But the other way is to realize that what's going on in that spirituality is the recognition that the natural world all around us is sacred, even to the point that you could say it is the real presence of God, of Christ. This is the revelation. You are already in heaven. And all those things are lovely when you're on the patio, glass of wine, sunshine, and feeling good in yourself as a person of faith. Whether you're a Buddhist, Christian, whatever. But where it becomes really consoling, where it becomes really helpful, I think, in my life, are the moments where I'm feeling down, where I'm feeling, this is not good what's happening to me, right? I'm aging or something. I don't like it. My body is stiff, or I'm in pain, or I'm emotionally depressed. I can't lift my energy, my spirit. This is a dark place to be. And when I was ordained a priest, I remember the motto I took was "Per tenebras ad lucem." Through the shadows, we come into the light. And when I read Rumi, I see the line that says, "The wound is where the light comes in." And when I read John of the Cross, I think he's telling me that the dark night of the soul is a beautiful and exquisite intimacy with God. So eventually in my own life, maybe 10 years ago, and I'm suffering physically, and I realize for the first time that this too is in some way the revelation of God. That my suffering is God suffering. It's really, this is something that I have no competence in explaining. No ability to explain. And yet I feel I want to share it with you because it's my story. And the only way that I can share the story is writing. I mean, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, and that's why I'm doing the sequence of these readings from various books throughout the summer. It's my only way to share what I feel I've gone through in the past decade. I feel I have changed in some huge way. I feel that experience has changed me, or the way that I began to look at my experience. And my experience has been, small difficulties. I wouldn't over dramatize them. They're nothing compared to what many people suffer. And as regards aging, I mean, I'm still a healthy young man, so of 70. But it's like I've got a first touch or tinge of where life is not always a party. You're not always up on the moon. You're not always sitting on the patio with a glass of wine on a sunny day, and it's not always fun. And it's how that experience over the past 10 years, manifested in various forms of illness, has in some way kind of allowed me to deepen my Christian faith, allowed me to understand God's presence, not as remote, but as intimate, as very, very close, as so close that there's no distinction, between the experience of being me and the realization that this this is actually God's revelation. The only thing that distances me is a sense of ego. You know, it's a sense of where I hide myself from that truth. Then I concoct an ego that is alienated and is suffering. But if I let go, the Buddha's teaching is the same on this. You know, the Buddha's teaching is that we are Buddha. It's just that we haven't realized it yet. And that all suffering is a process of awakening to the true nature of who you are. So attachment, desires and dislikes, all that self-clinging in Buddha's terms would be seen as delusional. It's letting go of that stuff. The letting go of who you are is what's causing the pain. Because what's underneath is the Buddha, the all-compassionate, all-wise being. You know, you can never get round this stuff. You can never get to a point where you name the bird here. You never name the mystery of God's presence. You can only live it. It's another lovely thing Therese or somebody said, you know, life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be experienced. And the idea of living mystery or living an experience, I'll leave you with this last, because I think this is such a catchphrase to awaken you every day, to open you. There's so much, by the time we brush our teeth, we've already concocted a whole lot of narratives about who we are and why we're problematic and how we should solve our problems. But life is not a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be experienced. And that one phrase can sometimes be an opening into living the day more beautifully, more deeply, more in the rhythm of God's presence within you. But no words can do this. No podcast, no words can explain anything. And me, let me tell you, most of all me, I am not a teacher. I'm not a teacher. I'm not wise, and I could be contradicting myself all over the place. The only thing I am is a storyteller, and that's why I'm going to continue for another couple of weeks sharing readings from the different books. So to finish off this particular podcast, which has been a kind of an interim thing, I'm going to finish off by reading a little more from On Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. And the last piece I read last week from it was very much tracking the idea of therapy and how I grappled with the idea of therapy when I was young and when I got older, and how then when I got into anxiety and depression, I needed it. But I feel that this is it's a short book, and yet there's an awful big story in it, because the second half of it shifts towards, it's what happened to me in 2016, and that was I began to move from therapy towards religious faith. I began to kind of feel a bigger enthusiasm about religion than I ever had. I'd never experienced its potential, if you like, as a psychotherapy in itself, as a sort of a magical, mythical narrative. So perfect story for storyteller. I never experienced that as in itself a psychotherapy. I was talking to somebody on Saturday evening, having a pizza, and I just happened to say offhandedly, the reason why I use religion is because it makes me feel good. You know, it brings happiness or peace. I mean, if happiness is sitting on the patio with the glass of wine, the sun shining, and having a lovely chat, then you can only be happy for a very short bit of the time. So there needs to be a model of happiness or peace that is able to embrace your experiences when you're not feeling good, when you're down, when you're sad, when you're lonely. Not like that you have to keep battling to get out of being sad. Not to keep labeling yourself as problematic because you have a physical illness or because you have emotional difficulties or anxieties, or because, like me, you're just neurotic. Then happiness becomes very thin and the moments of it are few and far between. You need a bigger template that embraces who you are in all your fragility, in all your weakness, in all your foibles, and even in all your kind of moral failures, like your anger, your jealousy, your greed, your gluttony, the whole 7 deadly sins. You need a big picture therapy that embraces them and still allows you deep inside that sorrow to experience joy. And that, to me, is where religion matters. Maybe my problem is that I can never quite connect it. I can never sync it with the right religion or the right practice of religion. I mean, I can sync it. I take all Buddhist philosophy as philosophy and take it as true. And within that context, I take every word of the Gospels as true, as the true narrative, the only narrative. This is my journey. So there you are. I hope you're having a great summer. I hope it continues. I hope you continue enjoying the podcast every weekend. And I'll be sticking to a few more readings from the books. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.